Welcome, everyone, both virtually and in person, to the Blavatnik School of Government. My name is Thomas Hale. I'm an associate professor here, and it's a great pleasure to have you all with us today for what I think is probably one of the most important conversations happening at this university, and indeed any university, which is about how institutions of higher education respond to the world we actually live in, and the time and place we actually live in, which is one that will be shaped, already is shaped, and will increasingly be shaped by the climate crisis. So I'm really delighted we have a great set of discussions planned for tonight, but I just want to start by kicking off that a little bit of framing on how we think about that big, almost impossibly big question of how universities rise to the occasion of a climate crisis. And usually it's boiled down, often I find this in classes, to, are you really depressed or not? Basically, are you super depressed? And if so, isn't that terrible? And obviously, we like to have a bit more nuanced thinking around these kinds of things. And someone has once said that intelligence is the ability to hold different ideas in your head at the same time. And so we have to kind of hold this idea that, yes, we've changed the climate a huge amount already and are on course to change it a lot more with truly devastating consequences. And those are going to be important challenges that we need to think about. We also have to remember that we have a lot of agency to shape how much more we change it or not, and also how we react to those changes. Do we adapt? Do we become more resilient or not? And that agency that we all have is a source, maybe not of unbridled joy, but of at least a determined optimism to be able to shape the future we're living in, not just endure what will happen. And I think that's how the School of Government in Oxford really thinks about this challenge, how we in the Blavatnik School think about it as what can we do given that the structural conditions of politics in the 21st century will be driven by the impacts of climate change, the process of decarbonization, these big macro trends. So it's also something though that universities are really just beginning to really deeply grapple with, I think. Maybe a bit, later than would be ideal, but tomorrow is worse than today, and today is better than yesterday. So let's get going. I'm delighted we have a really fascinating initiative to discuss tonight, led by a great thinker on these questions, who I'll introduce to give a few remarks before turning to some discussants from closer to home to talk about some reactions to those remarks, and then to share a bit more what we're doing in the Blavatnik School on these questions. But the main speaker tonight is Laurie Leyburn-Langton, who is an award-winning researcher, author, and strategist, and he leads a project called Cohort 2040, which he's going to say a lot more about in a second. But he comes to this from a background that merges both academic research, think tank work, and policymaking. He's currently based at Chatham House, but he's worked at the Institute for Public Policy Research in the UK Parliament, and right here down the road at the Institute for New Economic Thinking in Oxford. So brings a really powerful combination of interests and expertise points, but also of different sectors of society he's worked in. And that's necessary, as you'll see in a minute, because the way we need to think about the response to the climate crisis merges a lot of different things together. So it's good to think laterally about these problems. So Laurie, we're delighted you're here. It'd be great if you could tell us a bit more about what Cohort 2040 means, and then we'll think about what that might mean for our work here in Oxford. Welcome.
Thanks very much, Tom. Am I right to roam with this mic I've got on here? You can all hear me. Okay, brilliant. And hello to those of you who are watching online. I'm going to start off by providing a bit of a framing presentation on a bit of analysis I've got, and I'll introduce you to my project, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion that we have today. I hope you can all see online the slides that I have. You of course can all see them here in the room. As Tom says, I'm largely based in policy research. I'm at Chatham House, the International Affairs Research Organisation, as well as the Institute for Public Policy Research, IPPR, a think tank based in London. And through those institutions, I'm doing a project called Cohort 2040, which is looking at the growing challenge facing emerging leaders from the environmental crisis. And the way I like to think of this is of a storm. In fact, I think across my entire life, I'm in the beginning of my 30s, the environmental crisis has been framed in terms of there being a storm on the horizon. And we're on a ship or a flotilla of ships, and we're heading towards that storm. And effective, largely incremental policy would ensure that we would change the bearing and we would ultimately sail past the storm. But as we know, the bearing was not changed enough. And in some ways, you could say we've accelerated toward, and we're now increasingly entering the storm. And the key argument today is that's got huge implications for the strategy to avoid the very worst, to reduce emissions, to reduce impacts on the wider environment, and to ensure that societies are adapted to inevitable impacts. And let's start though with why I think that we're increasingly heading into the storm. I think there are three pretty brutal truths that have emerged in a lot of the analysis that we've seen in recent years, particularly out of the IPCC, the UN science body on the climate crisis. And this is the first one. Now 96% of those emission scenarios that the IPCC develops to look at how the climate crisis could evolve into the future, 96% of them now lead to overshoot of this 1.5 degree target that is enshrined in the international agreements on the climate crisis. So we are on a trajectory into increasingly an unknown space, a place that the world has not been in, or modern societies have not been in. Secondly, the impacts so far are greater than we may have anticipated in the past. The extent and magnitude of climate change impacts are larger than estimated in previous assessments. And we see that with the various impacts that we've seen around the world in recent years. And then thirdly, this diagram here is from the latest United Nations Environment Programme report on the adaptation gap. And it shows that despite encouraging trends, the rate and scale of adaptation progress is not enough to keep with growing needs. So there's this growing adaptation gap and a lack of resilience even to current impacts. And what I think is that means the chance of an orderly transition in which effective policy was delivered and the costs were kept low is increasingly ending, and we are entering a world of increasing disorder. So how can we think of that? Well, often we use this kind of frame to understand the risks of the growing environmental crisis. We have the transition risks, which could include the risk to investment balance sheets from not investing in the huge opportunities for renewable energy, the reputational risks of staying with investments in fossil fuels. We could talk about the physical risks, so the direct impacts of storms, the loss in this graph of labor productivity because of extreme heat. But as we enter an increasingly disorderly world, I think we've got to expand our understanding of what risks that we will be facing. So on those transition risks, I think we've also got to include the risks associated with the growing need to have negative emissions technologies to suck huge amounts of carbon out of the atmosphere, and the potential pitfalls there of impacts upon equity, of the ability to develop the technologies to do so, of natural means of sucking carbon down being increasingly impacted by the effects of rising temperatures. We've also got to expand our understanding of physical risks wider to incorporate an understanding of potential severe, even catastrophic tipping points in the natural environment. This little diagram here is from a simulation of the impacts upon the ability for Britain to grow food if the Great Atlantic Overturning circulation that moderates temperatures and pressures across the Atlantic were to collapse, which, as we've read in recent IPCC reports, cannot be ruled out. But more than just these transition and these physical risks, a more disorderly world has got to incorporate an analysis of systems risks. And let me explain what I mean by that. Here's a diagram here of the extraordinary temperatures that occurred in North America last summer, the so-called heat dome that occurred there. This was on the news. The destruction of the township of Lytton in Canada was on the news. There it is on the left from Google Street View. On the right, what happened to it after a couple of days of the extreme fires that we saw from the heat. What was less on the news was what then happened subsequently, including that extreme heat and the fires and so on impacted the ground in Canada, which then, when floods came in the winter, led to landslides, which affected the roads and the railways, which then had a knock-on impact on Canada's trade, which was already suffering because of the ongoing impacts upon the delicate balance of trade globally as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and other effects. It's those kind of cascades through our interconnected social and economic systems have got to be increasingly in our minds in a more disorderly world. And this diagram here comes from the 2019 Global Assessment Report of the UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction. I think does quite a good job of giving you a good visual metaphor of how we get these cascades through systems. Not just the direct impacts of the storms or the transition risks, it's how they cascade through our globalized world and they interact and amplify each other. Recent studies at Chatham House, using huge expert solicitation processes to talk to people who have an eye on these risks, have identified a range of those cascades and serious areas of concern in the next couple of decades through the 2020s and more so as we head towards the 2040s. And those systems risks also need to be considered within the natural environment as well. And this here is some of you may have seen these diagrams here of the interconnected systems risks associated with rising temperatures, how there could be shutdowns in the Atlantic, overturning circulation, as I was talking about just now, collapse in the Amazon rainforest, and those elements can then interact with other parts of the climate system globally. So we have to think about those systems risks. But a level above that, we can't just think of those three in isolation to each other. This is not just a series of progressively more destructive events. This is increasingly an era, a new era of risk, a much more complex, uncertain, dangerous time. And the way I like to think of this, having studied physics as my first degree, and forgive me for this nerdiness here, sometimes we think of the risks associated with the environmental crisis largely as a laminar flow, like a gushing torrent, getting more destructive, gushing forth as we head up the temperature range. But it's much more complex than that. It's much more like a turbulent flow, a much more uncertain, more random, more chaotic world, not just one in which there's progressively more destructive sequence of events, but one in which it's very difficult to discern the order of events, the causality of those events, and how effectively to respond. And for me, a core implication of a more chaotic world is that it threatens, that turbulence challenges the transition itself, could challenge our ability to deal with the root cause, to reduce emissions, to reduce impacts upon the environment, to deliver the levels of adaptation that are needed, and ultimately avoid runaway changes in the natural environment. And I think there's a number of ways we could think about this, a number of destructive feedback loops in societies that could begin to erode our ability to do this. So the first is a new type of denial, kind of implicatory denial, a denial of the implications of that more turbulent world. An example of this is live now. A British newspaper is attacking a British journalist, a broadcast journalist, about making certain connections between events out in the world, particularly famines and so on, with the climate crisis. And the question becomes, well, we will never be able to make, with absolute certainty, a connection between chaotic events and then back to the environmental crisis. We're going to have to deal with that uncertainty, with that chaos. And we cannot continue to either have a very high bar of the proof or to deny it or to deny the existence of that complexity. Distraction. At the end of February, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the world was understandably distracted from the release of the latest IPCC report at the time. And we have seen time and time and again in the chaotic events recently, there has been this understandable process of being distracted from environmental imperatives that could get worse into a more chaotic future. Then a defensive reaction, a reaction in which protection of national interests, resources, and so on becomes even more pronounced than it is at the moment, or even darker types of defense. Sadly, there was a mass shooting in America recently. You may have heard this. It's another example of a so-called manifesto being released by one of these shooters that uses what I would call eco-nativist, others call eco-fascist frames about overpopulation and so on. And this keeps happening time and time again. And it's starting to connect with a wider politics that's saying, it's ditching the denial, outright denial of the science, and saying liberal elites knew, we all saw what the scientists were saying, they didn't act, the world is now broken, and we need to protect what's left and lash out to get what is beyond our borders. Could that kind of a politics emerge and become more pronounced into the future? And then being completely overwhelmed. We're already, of course, starting to see this, the constant warnings from low-lying island states about how they literally could disappear soon. Countries thinking about moving their capital cities. In a more disorderly, chaotic world, could we be in a situation where countries, communities simply cannot deliver the focus needed to deliver a mitigation because they are overwhelmed by the consequences of a more chaotic world? I think these are some of the destructive feedbacks, socioeconomic feedbacks, that we could expect from an increasingly turbulent world. And in some ways, you could say that we've seen some of these now. And in the extreme, they could present another type of momentum that pushes the world over this threshold. This is a diagram from a few years ago that introduced the concept of a hothouse Earth, where runaway changes in the natural world would start to create a momentum of their own, and we would largely lose agency over being able to steward us back to a more stable world, and we could slip down into a runaway process towards unacceptably hot temperatures globally. It could be that these socioeconomic dynamics could be another powerful force propelling us down into this, in this conceptual space, in a sort of runaway process, an intrinsic feedback that exists within societies and economies themselves. But chaos also presents opportunities for positive feedbacks. Some of these we already intuitively grasp onto, like, for example, the growing momentum with technologies and markets, that we've had rapid changes, ones that were just not necessarily anticipated before, in the rollout of renewable technologies and how markets are reacting to those. And it's been quite extraordinary to see how that's happened in recent years and how momentum has picked up in the context of recent chaotic events. But it goes even deeper than that. These feedbacks, these potential tipping points, moments of rapid change exist in other parts of society as well. Rapid changes in norms. It's quite something to look to other movements, say the movement for gay and lesbian rights in the UK, and to see extraordinarily abrupt change occur in my lifetime. To see that in a multitude of other places, smoking, so on and so forth. These abrupt changes in norms, in morality, in legitimacy of certain ideas and functions in the economy and society. Movements as well. It was quite remarkable to see the emergence of, say, the Fridays for Future movement. I remember reading some books. I think there's a Jonathan Porritt book, The British Environmentalist, that talks, that's framed around a school teacher in 2050 teaching their primary school kids what had happened in the preceding number of decades to reach the point where they'd got to net zero and so on. And one of the key moments in that story was a movement of kids of school age just appeared, and just had a massive impact globally. I remember reading this book and being like, okay, sure. And it's extraordinary that those kind of tipping points have occurred. Rapid movements have shot up. And we see this ultimately reminds us what we know is one of the deeper leverage points for changing systems, that we've had very rapid changes in mindsets in all of the cases of what I just listed. And these are, I would say, these are constructive socioeconomic feedback loops, and the ones that we can identify and trigger and help along to push the ball over the hill. We've seen that in all of these cases. Just to give one example, we've seen that with technology and public policy, where the collapse in coal power in this country was largely a result of pretty smart public policy being put in there to make sure that the price of coal was sufficiently high and led to a collapse in its use. And there are many other market tipping points, technological tipping points, hiding in the wings, hiding for non-orthodox public policy to come along and pump them over the edge, and more politics and more potential moments of chaos in which there could be a shift in the orthodox approach to what's going on. So, a more turbulent world, the potential for destructive but also constructive socioeconomic feedbacks. How can we respond to this? Well, I think the first thing to say is that it needs to be a lot of analysis, improvement in analysis on these turbulent dynamics. We have got a reasonably sophisticated ability to try and understand the consequences largely of rising temperatures and the physical impacts of these. We need to extend that analytical capability to understand how that interacts with the degradation of the wider environment, of biodiversity loss and so on, and how they interact. And then to better understand and anticipate these cascades through societies that I was describing earlier. We really need to improve our analytical capabilities here. All of this, if you incorporate a kind of turbulent analysis into the future, will just double down on what we already need to do. It will further lower the threshold of what should be seen as acceptable environmental change even lower when you incorporate these cascades and so on. And that underlines the need for emergency mitigation globally and the need for resilient strategies, synergistic resilient strategies, not maladaptive, that help on the mitigation and ensure that we can weather the storm as we head into it. It also requires a rebalancing of power in how we analyze and manage risk. When you have a more turbulent frame, the experience of those on the front line, the grinding poverty, the loss of the ability to meet nutritional needs and how they interact with political, economic, and other factors comes even more to the forefront. And what that means is you've got to put those communities who are experiencing that at the forefront. And the way we talk about risk globally has got to be rebalanced to those who are experiencing those situations and therefore have a greater attunement to those cascading dynamics. It also means going beyond the sectors that we associate with risk and looking at others who are thinking about this in a deep way. And then I think it requires, even more than just expertise, a new class of communicators when it comes to the environmental crisis. We've got to get to this point where the main people now who are talking about it aren't just the fantastic climate scientists who are talking about how certain decisions could lead to certain temperature rise into the future. We need a much more blended type of communications that can credibly, accessibly talk about the types of cascades that I've been talking about, the full picture of what risk looks like into the future. But, and this is kind of my final point now, where I'll come on to my project, I think there's something even more fundamental than what could here be a risk of sort of policies or things that could end up happening. Let's look at the temperature rise since the 1950s and consider how over these periods, well, you can look at those and think there have been certain mitigation adaptation periods in that time, right? In which people considered the types of positive feedbacks they wanted to stimulate in society. You could say that the 70s, 80s was a period in which there was growing development of the science of that then being communicated to populations and policymakers, reaching the kind of seminal moment in that period where you had James Hansen, the climatologist, making presentations to politicians on the Hill in the US. You could say that the next period, as we headed towards 2000 and beyond, was a period that was dominated by a kind of a response from many vested interests who were there to potentially lose out here. While there was a growing international movement, the creation of the IPCC and the UN processes for negotiating on the climate crisis, there was this sort of counter movement by certain elite interests and the sowing down, so on and so forth. As we head more towards the modern day, you could say the current mitigation adaptation period is on one side, full of positive socioeconomic feedbacks being triggered, of movements growing, of certain narratives, better understanding, market shifting, public policy seeking to push a green transition or green recovery under more chaotic conditions, while on the other side, distraction and delay and other negative feedbacks. My question is, well, what type of strategies do we need in future mitigation and adaptation periods? How do we ensure that the transition is able to be accelerated, a better transition, a fairer, more resilient transition happens in futures that could exist in these lines here of different projections of rising temperatures? We need a strategy to navigate that turbulence. It goes beyond, it goes deeper, even beyond policies, into making sure that the overall strategy, and as much as one can occur globally, is a connected effort of all countries and communities that needs to be robust to navigate this turbulence. And this is where we come now to the project I'm doing. That necessity places a pretty big burden, of course, on younger generations. A while back, when I was working, not on this project, I was working in public policy research on the climate crisis. I, in a bored moment, put my date of birth into the UK government's little app where you can work out when you're supposed to retire. And I'm supposed to retire in 2056, right? I don't believe that for 1 second. And it made me realize that people who are kind of my generation, and of course younger, are sort of the first people of which reaching net zero, largely by 2050, is something that happens within their career, is a subset of their career. Obviously, the younger you get, the more it just becomes a smaller potential subset of how long their career will last, So in that time, by the time I got to retire, largely we need to reach net zero. We need to deliver the vast negative emissions capabilities to deal with the previous failure to adequately mitigate. We need to roll out massive adaptation, close that adaptation gap, make sure it stays closed if and when temperatures rise. And that's a pretty big heft, right? The average age of the world population is 31, which happens to be exactly half the average age of world leaders at the moment. So a millennial, kind of middle-aged millennial, that age group will be senior leaders everywhere, largely, by 2040, hence the name of this project, Cohort 2040. And that means that this generation and those younger have got to answer that question of how we develop robust mitigation adaptation to deal with growing turbulence. And that's beyond just individual policies. As someone who is a public policy professional, I can only really comprehend, or in the past can only really comprehend of things as something that I could write a 10,000 word PDF about. Thought, wow, great, policies will sort this out. But it made me think that no, this is something more fundamental. This is actually about leadership, because we can't anticipate what those policies will necessarily be in that more chaotic future, sort of the nature of things like turbulence. So it's about leadership. And at the moment, you look around and you see how leaders are dealing with current chaotic conditions. It doesn't look so great, right? They're failing to ensure that they can anticipate threats properly. This is how these are ranks from just before COVID, putting the US and the UK as the most prepared nations for a pandemic. And we know what happened there. For dealing with cascades, this here shows the huge increase in excess deaths that occurred in care homes in the UK when the British government, it's now been ruled as illegal, sent people away from hospitals into care homes, and they took COVID with them. That's a cascading effect that wasn't necessarily properly anticipated. Missing the ability to grasp chaotic moments and drive rapid change. Missing the opportunity for levelling up and green opportunities here in the UK. Not being able to show ideological flexibility. We saw this in the pandemic when, even though local authorities in the UK have probably about 2 centuries worth of experience of doing local test and tracing of diseases, were not given the adequate resources or the authority to do that, at least early on in the pandemic. And currently is failing to provide the kind of credible leadership that connects with populations that is needed in chaotic moments. Partygate here in the UK is an example of that. And the cascading consequences include the increasing delegitimization of government, of authority, and the rise of conspiracy theories and so on. My fear is that if we, as a generation and those below us, continue on the leadership development trajectory that led to this, then leadership will largely become another stranded asset in an increasingly chaotic world. And so what I'm doing at the moment in my work is considering what kind of capabilities are going to be needed to navigate that turbulence. The analytical ones, the emotional ones, the ability to work in organizations, our political and policy ones, and our ability to work with others around the world. And how we can, what knowledge we can provide to people, what competencies, what trained skills, but then also the deeper inner capacities that are needed, the emotional resilience and so on. An example of this, I would say, of knowledge, of sort of policy, political knowledge, is understanding the policy toolkit for a kind of post-austerity, mission-oriented state. It's able to make the huge investments needed. Trained skills include the ability to build coalitions between those who are relatively sheltered in the global north and those who are on the front line, or also within countries. And the inner capability analytically to be highly adaptive, open, curious. But I actually think that they're kind of this mitigation adaptation period. I think this is kind of what we need right now. This is the leadership we need right now. We're talking about something even more than that. We're talking this as a baseline onto then the mitigation adaptation period in the future. Policymakers have got to have in the future, presumably, some kind of basic knowledge of how shocks to food systems will cascade through interlinked global systems and what capabilities exist domestically and internationally to deal with those situations. We're experiencing one right now. The emotional, the ability to communicate to fearful populations who are under stress, to overcome polarizing defensive responses from those populations. And the inner capability to have empathy, compassion as a basis to build relationships between global north and global south, an even more fractious, chaotic world. So at the moment, I'm exploring these kind of things and how we could train them among emerging leaders along their journey to senior leadership into the future. And fundamentally, the project is about the intersection of the emerging leadership we are seeing in younger generations that in many ways is bringing hope and inspiration with the vast challenges I've just been talking about and the general lack of some mid-career support that many of those in that generation are struggling with the idea being that we help emerging leaders better deliver the transition under increasingly chaotic circumstances. And the last thing I'll say before we get on to a bit of conversation is this is about regaining agency over the increasingly chaotic outlook. It's about transferring the feeling that I've often had, I've seen others have of, sure, but some of this stuff should have happened 20 years ago, into a very sober conversation about how we can generationally, all generations can band together to ensure that we're able to deliver a better, faster transition under increasingly chaotic circumstances. So I'll leave it there. I hope that gave you some food for thought, and I very much look forward to having a bit of a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Laura. That's a fantastic discussion. It really ends where we want to go next, which is agency. How do we grasp some control over the increasingly turbulent future? We're sitting in a school of government. We are tasked in this institution with trying to create a world, as the motto says, and I wonder if there's any MPP students here who can say it, but I'll spare you the test. We want to create a world better led, better served, and better governed. And that's requires giving future public leaders the skills to be able to navigate the world that they're going to be leading, which is going to be a challenging one. So before we're turning to questions, I do hope there'll be lots of questions and discussions both in the room and on the Zoom. And if you're thinking of a question on the Zoom, you can already begin to type it into the Q&A box there. Before we go there, we're going to hear two reactions to Laurie's thesis from current MPPs, one of whom is in person, one of whom is online. And they're also going to share a few words. And I should say, for those of you who may not know, the MPP is the Masters of Public Policy, our flagship master's program here at the Blavatnik School. They're going to share some ideas, not just on how they're thinking about this challenge, but also what we are beginning to do in the school to think about how to train public leaders to live in the world that we now live in. So can I first introduce Tessa Vincent, who has a background in law and politics in New Zealand. She worked in Parliament there, and also for a judge and for a minister. She's passionate about tackling climate change, but also food waste reduction, has worked a lot on food waste, and is here in the Blavatnik School, one of the leaders of something called the MPP Climate Warriors, which have been thinking about how we internalize this challenge. So Tessa, over to you, please.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Laurie. Really exciting project. I want to talk to you more and find out how we can take part. So as Tom mentioned, I'm from New Zealand and one member of the very passionate MPP Masters in Public Policy Climate Warriors. And I'm here to briefly talk about what we have been doing over the past 9 months as climate warriors in the School of Government and a few thoughts on what I hope the School of Government can bring and build on these initiatives in the future. So there's 3 areas I'm going to talk about, and these are sort of student-led initiatives that I hope in the future initiatives like Cohort 2040 can build on, especially in an institution like Oxford. So you talked a lot about leadership, and one initiative, small scale, that we do have, but which has been one of the most rewarding series of events that I've gone to here at Oxford are our climate breakfasts. So while some in the cohort decide to sleep in, a few crazy MPP climate warriors get up in the early hours of the morning and meet for a breakfast session every fortnight. And someone in the group talks about a topic that they have particular experience or passion or interest for. So we've had talks on transport, finance, and climate communication. And these are intimate settings which I think allow us as students to kind of present and refine our areas of interest. And I hope that in the future they can maybe be a bit more formalized and sort of be integrated into the wider Blavatnik School of Government. The second area is we've gone on a couple of field trips. And I think that this really shows that you can study at Oxford, but you really need to get out there into the community every now and then to actually understand the issues that are happening. So a couple of weeks ago, we went to farm education. So if you are based in Oxford, I would highly recommend traveling out to the Cotswolds to farm education, where we learnt about the struggles and intricacies of regenerative farming. It was an incredible session, and I think it gave us a lot of food for thought, no puns intended. Finally, the third area that we've tried to gain some progress on are connections across the Oxford community. So you can come to Oxford and think, gosh, there's a lot going on here, and it's very exciting and vibrant. But then it can be overwhelming, and you just revert back into your bubble of your school and your class. So we've really tried to widen the climate network by connecting with the environmental change management course, which is a more specialised climate course in Oxford, and the Masters of Business students. So this has been limited to drinks and socializing. But I really hope that in the future, again, and maybe drawing from our staff and wider Blavatnik School of Government community, we can create more linkages across the different schools. So very inspiring, your talk. I hope we do navigate the turbulence that is ahead of us. But when I look into our 140 students from over 50 countries, I see incredible potential leaders who are determined to do something about climate change. And I really hope that we can be the future leaders that you're describing. Thank you.
Thank you, Tessa. Our next speaker is going to join us online, giving us an example of how with cascading crises, we're nonetheless able to, through technology and flexibility, be resilient. I'm delighted to introduce Nina Bengston, who is also a current MPP student here. And previously has worked as a political advisor in the European Parliament, focusing on climate change, has a background in electoral politics as well, and has been involved in a project here thinking about how we look at the whole curriculum from a climate lens. Nina, welcome.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you so much for the fascinating presentation. I especially loved your ending on how we have to regain agency. I think most people in the room and on the call will recognize the feeling that I've been sitting with, at least of having sort of grown up and become politically aware in the financial crisis, and then just lived through one crisis after the next of financial crisis, of a euro crisis, of a COVID crisis, and not least a climate crisis. So one of what I'll talk about today is some work that we've been doing in the cohort on doing a climate audit of our curriculum. So I really appreciate your sort of your three different buckets of knowledge, competencies, and inner capacities. And I think what we've been working on has been very much in the knowledge box. And this, it started so the starting point was a very basic outset that we wanted to ensure that no Master of Public Policy student could pass through the Blavatnik school without being exposed to the climate change challenge. And we found, and I think this is true of many, many schools, that sort of climate change issues were largely sort of put into a sort of a further reading bucket. And the hard truth was that many of our co-students and people in the community would rather look to sort of Bill Gates or your Elon Musks for technical solutions rather than towards political leaders and regulation when the topic came to climate change. So what we sort of our argument or our thoughts was that climate change, that the content and the concepts that were already in our curriculum were really well curated by experts in their field. So this is for a public policy student, we have to take courses in law, economics, philosophy, politics, and we come in as students, not as experts. And the Blavatnik School does have experts in this field. But examples within these courses related to climate change or case studies were really quite scarce. And we sort of set out to try and change that with two arguments. One is that we believe that all public policy students will go on to come to deal with climate change, no matter if they want to or not. So if you are interested in financial regulation, if you are interested in housing, if you want to work on poverty reduction or migration issues, whatever it is, climate change will be sort of an inevitable factor that you'll have to deal with. And so a public policy school really needs to equip their students to understand that challenge. And the second one is that climate change is actually an exceptionally good pedagogical vehicle to teach some of the concepts we were already learning. Talk about like discount rates, talk about intergenerational justice and philosophy. Who does the government actually serve? Current generation, the future generation, your own sort of within your own national borders or the globe as a whole. Two-level games, collective action, negative externalities, sort of the list goes on. And we set out to do an audit. So the whole thing is we sort of got together 10 students, sat down and went through the curriculums we already had and found articles, case studies that we presented in a sort of easily digestible manner and we'll sort of present to professors to try and convince them to include them into the core curriculum. And the idea is that climate change is no longer just a sort of an advocacy challenge. So it's actually really a technical, a regulatory challenge, and it's fine for us to hope for technological developments, but there's a lot of work to be done on the regulatory space.
Mm-hmm.
And so any public policy student must sort of be equipped to deal with this challenge. And so we're really happy to take the lead, and the school has been very welcoming of our initiative. And yeah, we hope that it'll be implemented for the future generations of students.
Thank you, Nina. It's great to think about future generations, not just as future people, but also future students who will be arriving very soon, actually. Tessa, welcome back up to the front. So we've had a presentation on why we need to think about this challenge. We've had some insights from our own cohort here in Oxford at the Blavatnik School, thinking about how we're wrapping our heads around it. But I'd love to throw the floor open both to people online and here in person. And those of you online, please just type your question into the chat. I will find it here on my handy iPad. And those of you, please just raise your hand. Love to hear reactions, sort of really two categories of things. One, reactions to the very clear but very challenging and stark world that Larry has fantastically laid out. but also ideas on how we mobilize on the agency part. What can we as universities do? What can we as a Blavatnik school do if you're so inclined, but also more generally, how do we build in more of the steps we're going to need to be able to take back a little control, to borrow a phrase, of the future? So the floor is open. Who wants to start us off? Please. And if you could just introduce yourself when you come in, that'd be great.
Thanks. I'm Paul. I'm a postgrad student in International Relations in Oxford, the DPIR. Thanks so much for all your input and in the presentation. I've seen that you're an economist, if I'm correct, and I'm wondering. So when you talk about what can be done and the strategies we need to equip leaders with, I'm wondering what you think about economic policy and to what extent economic policy has to change. And you once mentioned briefly mission-oriented interventions, and I'm just wondering whether you could talk more about that and how you see economic policy, what role you see for economic policy in this change. Thanks.
Thanks, Paul. Laurie, thoughts on economic policy? I think you might have an idea or two on that.
Thank you very much for the question. There have been, you could say, at least in countries like Britain, there have been a few periods, paradigms, political economic paradigms. There was one after the Second World War, the emergence of, in which in Britain, things like our National Health Service emerged, where the prevailing wisdom in policymaking was of a largely interventionist state, of huge parts of the economy maybe even being owned by the state. That then shifted. There was a big sea change after the crises of the 1970s that are often associated with the governments of Margaret Thatcher in the UK and Ronald Reagan in the US. And that ushered in a more a paradigm that was much more focused on markets being the primary driver of outcomes in economy and society. You could say, as many have said, including the, say, editorial board of the FT, that the current chaos means that we're starting to see the emergence of another potential paradigm, of another moment of a focal shift in economic policy, one that is comfortable with the huge amounts of spending that are required to enable furlough schemes, like in the UK and other countries in the world. One that wants to invest far more directly in the kind of investments that are needed to shift the dial on the environmental crisis and so on, right? I largely have come from a world that was looking at that process of the need for ideas like a mission-oriented state, of the need to move beyond a fixation, often not backed up by credible ideas, of reducing fiscal deficits above all else. It's almost the primary motivator of government policy. And that movement, if you could call it that, an intellectual movement, is one that I think is increasingly picking up speed. And it is, for me, integral to what happens next. I think there was always going to be a moment where countries around the world signed up to net zero targets, that net zero would become a concept that's increasingly seen globally. The question is then, well, how do you meet those targets? And that is going to require, because of the sort of vertiginous declines in emissions that are needed to reach net zero, it's going to require much less incrementalist policy, economic policy that's much more, about directing the direction of the economy and so on. My concern is that as turbulent conditions grow, that intellectual movement, which has sort of got the winds in its sails in a way at the moment, is scuppered, that it is unable to deal with the increasingly acrotic circumstances that it sees globally. The way I sometimes crudely characterize this is that, think forward to the end of the mid to late 2030s, and President Ocasio-Cortez is presiding over a Green New Deal in the US, but is unable to handle the compounding crises, political, economic, social, globally, so on and so forth. And that as a political agenda, as well as a governing policy agenda, is increasingly seen to be delegitimized because populations are grappling with some of the dynamics I described earlier. So my concern is less the need for that kind of shift in policy. I think that is an obvious point that has needed to filter its way into frontline policymaking for quite a while now. It's what happens next. It's how that project can can have a strategy to handle the increasingly chaotic circumstances that we'll see in this decade and beyond.
Great, and that actually speaks quite directly to a question I'm going to bring in from online before going back to the room. Virginia Newton-Lewis says, really love the idea of better equipping leaders. Thanks, Larry. I'm interested in the impact of turbulence on the efficacy of regulation as a tool to achieve net zero, e.g., she refers to a piece I wrote talking about the shift from voluntary to regulatory things. Thanks, Virginia. But the question is, are our regulatory models, and I think you're saying also this new potential economic paradigm, over-reliant on the notion of stability? E.g., as our turbulence increases, can we count on well-functioning states that will take forward programmatic policies through regulation and economic transformation, or is that going to be compromised? And if so, is there a different way to think about how we might achieve that, or like a plan B or C or D, I guess we're at this point, but how do you think about that kind of interaction?
I'd be really interested to get your take on this as well. For me, the idea that we will get, as was referenced there, to a point where fundamental stability in society breaks down, where states, for example, are no longer able to preside over things like regulation, so on and so forth, is a potential outcome that we could increasingly see, we already have seen around the world, always, but we could increasingly see as a result of a more turbulent world in the future. In large part, I think we need to see that as an outlier. What I'm particularly interested in is how we develop the type of tools within a different regulatory state that is able to handle very complex, very uncertain situations. A lot of the modeling capacity that governments use that underpins some of the policymaking, as some of us know, is based upon an understanding of the past, is drawn from modeling based on the past, and we know that past has been relatively stable compared to the kind of this discontinuity that we could be increasingly heading into, which means that we will struggle with our analytical capability to even deliver a kind of new paradigm of regulation or wider policymaking. And I think that this is an area I don't know a huge amount, but it's one that I've always found quite interesting, that the actuaries in insurance companies, those who are particularly interested in risk, are using models that are largely based on certain assumptions in financial economics that makes it very difficult to increasingly incorporate elements of the climate crisis as things stand now. To then add the addition to that of an increasingly turbulent world in which it's very difficult to use the past as any reasonable guide to what is happening, for me is a real pressing thing that sits behind what I was saying about the need for better analytical capability here. And as a last bit, we're going to have to get more comfortable with moving away from a quantitative first and always approach to how we're developing policymaking. When the UK government's climate change risk assessment came out recently, I think it was last year, the headline of the press release was, by 2045, climate change could cost something like 1% of GDP. And if we think we can quantify the hit on GDP from a simultaneous loss of 10% of the crop of the 4 major breadbasket regions, which might be the chance happening of 50-50 by 2040, we're having a laugh. I mean, we're just missing the point if we're having that focus. So we've got to develop much more. We've got to credibly incorporate a different approach to how we perceive these things into policymaking.
Yeah, no, and on the governance challenges, I think seeing the state as a sole and only provider of order and regulation and collective action is probably going to be challenged in this era, where we're already seeing the climate change space open up the possibility of governance by cities, by municipalities, by other kinds of social actors, and that's arguably a form of resilience as we go forward. Question over here, please, and if you could introduce yourself first.
Steininger, I'm an environmental economist. How do we get beyond this incremental policy? Has there been an example in the past also that the governing bodies provided for the fora to really develop this future vision? You just said it's no longer, we cannot learn enough from the past. We need a future vision to bring together business, civil society, to provide this fora. Was there past experience in such task, and how relevant is it to really develop this together that then draws us to it, to the future we want?
Any promising models to look back to it?
It's a very good question. I think well, let me talk about what I'm particularly interested in at the moment. I think that there is a process happening now everywhere, at least I've been to, where people in business, in policymaking, so on and so forth, are engaging in a conversation. It may not be a systematic one that is available to publics, that, you know, even in some ways connected to the electoral system or something like that, or deliberative democracy. In fact, I find it very difficult to think of a conference that I've been to, online or off, in recent years, where there isn't some version of that conversation happening. My concern is less the kind of visioning of potential futures. That seems to be rampant, at least in my experience. Though, of course, there's always more need for that and for that conversation to be opened up to wider populations, particularly through things like citizens' assemblies or other ideas of rooting an idea or exploring ideas of the future. It's that there has been a collapse in the imagination in policymaking to be able to then translate those futures into reality, I think, at least in my view. And I think we sort of seen this in the context of COVID. There was an opportunity earlier on in the pandemic, I think, where governments, of course, were overwhelmed, they were very busy, where you had the threat, the fear, and the psychological and emotional responses at population level from that. You then had the extraordinary relief in the recognition that collectively societies can achieve extraordinary things in the face of massive threats. Furlough schemes, of mutual aid societies as a more bottom-up kind of response. And moments of potential rapid change in the context of crisis, for me, almost in the final analysis, are psychological, emotional moments. And that was not seized upon politically. And there are questions about whether that could have happened because policymakers were overburdened with dealing with the crisis situation. But that we didn't have the imagination to say, right, well, a load of the sacred cows of the orthodoxy have been slaughtered because we had to deliver the furlough scheme and we had to finance that and so on and so forth. Maybe we could be creative with what happens next. Yeah. I mean, the baseline level was the recovery should also meet our environmental goals. And even that wasn't necessarily achieved. So for me, there's envisioning going on everywhere, but it's that we don't have particularly the policy leadership that can signal that the future is something that a different future is something we can strive for.
Yeah, and I think that's why the leadership angle you're taking in this project is really essential. How do you articulate a vision and then bring people to that vision is a central challenge. I wonder, Nina, Tessa, any thoughts on this idea of discontinuity or how you build political support for this kind of new vision?
I would actually like to pose a question as well, just to sort of bring to some concretes maybe. Because I think it's really fascinating, especially what you're talking about dealing with compounding crises in your example with an AOC president. Do you have examples in mind of leaders who are actually currently able to do this, like who have shown some of the skills in sort of taking a step back during the COVID pandemic and dealing with these compounding crises well, or sort of, to make it concrete, as people in the room and on the call might be interested in actually figuring out what are the skills that that one should be developing. Where to look.
I'm clearly a proud New Zealander who will mention Jacinda Ardern's probably one of the few leaders that talks about transformational change and kind of futures, and is very focused on, I think because she has a 2-year-old daughter herself, what the future is going to look like. And while there's been criticisms of sort of action by the government in New Zealand to get to that, I think the ability to deal with crises through her leadership has been very strong. I'd be interested in your analysis on that. And I think one of your bubbles was the ability to kind of relate with empathy to other people. And when we had some horrible mosque shootings in the South Island of New Zealand, that was a really clear, strong skill set. But I'd be interested in your view beyond the small bubble of New Zealand. Who else shows those qualities?
But I think that is a really good example. She is someone that does spring to my mind as being able to communicate to, well, one is the different layers of communication, right? Being able to communicate very difficult, complex issues effectively to a population. I think she did that quite well in the context of COVID. I think that Angela Merkel did a decent job, maybe on her science background as well, to be able to explain certain concepts around the pandemic, to be able to then soothe and engage very scared populations who, in large parts, countries like New Zealand, like Britain, were used to pretty high levels of stability for a very long time. And the social psychology of being able to engage with populations in very scary, chaotic times is incredibly important. It's always been important. There were certain leaders who did it better than others. To give another example, let's take one speech that was given by Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, early on in COVID. There are three things that I would flag in this speech. And this may be an amalgamation of two. Might not got the timeline right here. He announced the policy of the furlough scheme, which, if you had gone even a few days before and said a Conservative Chancellor of the Exchequer will essentially underwrite all private sector wages in this country, you'd fall off your seat. It would be unimaginable that would happen. And of course, the necessity meant it had to happen. But in chaotic conditions, you've got to ditch the orthodoxy just immediately, just straight away. It's gone, boom. And at the moment, we associate that just with moments of crisis. Furlough, and then we're back to the norm. Brief deviation from the norm, back to how it was before. You've got to have that type of flexibility, ideological in respect to policy, at all times, right? Second thing is he was asked in the subsequent Q&A with journalists, how are you going to pay for all this, right? Classic. And he said, well, we're in touch with the Public Management Office and the way that Britain finances debt, and we think it's all fine, right? And that was connected to a very complex web of essentially policymaking in the financial system that meant that when we really need it to happen, we of course can pay for it. Because Britain is a country with monetary sovereignty, and there is a flexibility in how we can pay for things. It's amazing John Maynard Keynes quote about if we can actually do something, then we can afford it. If we can physically do it, we can afford to do it. There will be a moment where the environmental crisis runs out of control and we won't be able to do it, but we're not there yet. So we can afford to do it, right? So in announcing that policy and saying we can pay for it, it was connected to a whole range of different complex relationships, including with the Bank of England and financial markets, that enabled that to happen. And then the third thing is, at the end of the speech, he said, this is the early days when people were very, very scared. People remain scared, but this is at that height of it. And it was the evenings when the press conferences are happening. And at the end of the speech, he said, and when this is over, and it will be over, we will judge each other on how we behaved to each other. We'll judge ourselves and how we behave to each other throughout this pandemic. And whether you are, for Rishi Sunak's policies or party or so on and so forth, it was a pretty effective example, a rare one, sadly, in this country, of a politician putting their finger on the emotional, psychological moment within that crisis and offering balm to that population. And, you'd say, well, that's obvious, but leaders should do that. But if you watched all of the press conferences that the pandemic, that was a very rare example of that happening. So just in one example there are things that we can point to that are going to be, that at the moment is seen as extraordinary crisis leadership. That's the bread, has to be the bread and butter.
Really interesting. I think one difference from the COVID crisis, of course, and the climate crisis is addressed by our next question from online, which comes from Professor Rebecca Willis from Lancaster University. And she says, thanks to the brilliant and challenging presentation and responses, question, how do we cope with the sharp politics of vested economic interests, e.g. oil and gas companies who pledge allegiance to net zero but want to open just one more oil field? It's easy to praise renewables and call for an end to oil. Has the policy community been too focused on solutions and too polite to call out vested interests? The difference, of course, is that in COVID, Rishi Sunak was not arguing against the pro-COVID producing, interest groups. This is a political contest in some ways between different sectors of the economy. And so how does political leadership maybe need to think about that challenge? I'm embellishing a little bit on your question, Becky, but I hope it's okay.
Thanks, Becky. And thanks for your question. Good to give me an easy one. Yes, one of the perennial problems here is that the climate crisis is a story that's told without a sort of a bad guy. There's this amazing quote from, I forget, I'm really sorry, the academic who talks about how it's like telling Star Wars, but without Darth Vader. It's astonishing that we don't have the actors who are trying to subvert the situation, who are at the forefront of our story. I would hope that we get to the situation in coming years where there has been a shift in norms, where norms around the use of fossil fuels, the companies enable us, have been eroded, and that the potential bounce back of those actors in the context of Russia, Ukraine, as being the guys who rock up to save the day and provide you with the fossil fuels that you need to get, you need to get rid of Putin's, and here is the replacements, that doesn't get in the way. My concern is how we maintain that into a more turbulent future, how we can maintain a politics environmental crisis that will have bad actors, enemies, and so on in the narratives. Basically, a future in which we're telling the full Star Wars version of the climate crisis, right? Environmental crisis. But in a more turbulent world, those types of oppositional frames, of course, risk greater polarization. And there's a fantastic academic at King's in London, Chris de Meyer, and he's got a fantastic team around him that talk about a kind of pyramid of polarization, which is sort of driven by our actions, where you at the beginning you say, well, how am I going to vote on this referendum about the UK's future in the EU? Oh, well, I've heard these things. I'll vote. Yes, we should leave. And then you see someone talking on the news about how everyone who voted leave is an idiot. You think, I'm not an idiot. Well, of course I wanted to vote leave. I believe in the Leave project. And things, society breaks down into these sort of separated, people are walking down the other side of the pyramid. I agree absolutely with the need to make sure that fossil fuel companies and other bad actors are a key part of the political narrative here. My deeper, and just support the movements to make it happen. My deeper question is how, in a far more chaotic world, we're able to sort of more safely use these oppositional frames in a way that doesn't further drive chaotic polarization, which itself could be one of these destructive socioeconomic feedbacks.
Definitely. I think I have time for one or two more questions. Let me take one here and then take one here, and then we'll probably have to draw to a close. But Grace, please.
So yeah, it leads on from what you were just saying. What's the role of big tech, and in particular communication on big tech platforms in improving climate leadership? We're seeing that a lot of people are increasingly informed by what they see on those platforms, and the platform's business models are obviously engineered for virality and hyperbole and creating extreme views of division. And I just wonder there, to me, it seems like a major kind of generator function of what's going wrong in so many different areas because of how important it is for informing people now, or for shaping people's views. And I just wonder there, does that kind of, have you looked at what role that has had in where we've got to or haven't got to with climate? And is that part of your kind of vision in terms of what Cohort 2040 would do in addressing some of those problems with tech?
Great question. Let's take one more here before we close.
You both started by talking about the necessity of reclaiming agency and what that means for leadership. I'm wondering if you're also thinking about what it means for educating emerging citizens, not just in terms of knowledge, but in terms of developing the agency of not just current citizens, but those 2-year-olds, those children who are going to be coming into a world where it's not just what they know, it's the change that they can participate in that's going to be equally critical. Is your work addressing any of that dimension, the educational dimension, not of leaders, but of citizens?
I think our questioner has some experience with this, looking at education for human rights, if I'm not mistaken. So it's very, very interesting comparison. Can I come to you, Laurie, in those two questions around tech companies and education for citizens, and then take any final comments and observations from our panel?
Yes, that's great. Okay, tech one. Yeah, when you introduce a turbulent frame to how the future could be evolving, it changes, I think, a lot of perceptions of your analysis of threats into the future, right? Can we afford a situation where we continue to have the type of misinformation or polarization that we get from social media in a future in which we are having persistent breadbasket shocks, in which, you know, you mentioned the other horrific mass shooting in New Zealand, in which that type of politics that these mass shooters, as I mentioned in the presentation, talking about of the world is broken, we must protect what's ours, and so on and so forth. Can we afford to have the type of social media setup that we have at the moment into that future? And I'm not sure that, you know, we can credibly say that, that's another reason to properly regulate technology, to make sure that there's some kind of accountability for some of the things that are said on these platforms. But also, I think a better way to do that is to make sure that we sort of wrest the value inherent in the data that these platforms accumulate more into general population's hands. You know, you could imagine a situation in which you're able to say, well, all of this data is actually an extraordinary public resource, and we should crack open the data sets of these platforms, and that data should be, with all the right ways and complexities that come behind privacy and so on, available for people to innovate more in a public setting. That could be done by states, it could be done by regional authorities, like, for example, the city of Barcelona is experimenting with. And so tech becomes something that's less driven by the concerns of the profit making these platforms, and actually becomes something that's driven by the possibilities of what that data could do from a public perspective. I think that could play a role in making sure that societies are much more resilient and served by these technologies than the current trajectory that we're on, where they become a further wedge that drives polarization, which I guess is linked to how we make sure that emerging citizenry is better educated. When I say leaders here, part of me thinks about sort of, you know, the classic elite model of making sure that we're training leaders and so on. But, you know, leadership has, by the definition of a more turbulent world, leadership has got to be something that is at all levels. We can only have truly resilient societies if we have local communities upward are as resilient as possible. You know, we're in a world in which, in a connected world that's going to get shaken and shaken and shaken and shaken more and more. In some ways, we are as strong as our weakest or most exposed member. The way that was described in the pandemic of, you know, we need to make sure we vaccinate the global south so that the potential for variants is not increased and it blows back against people in the global north and so on and so forth. The same kind of dynamic, though, of leaving people and places exposed, kind of sacrifice zones and so on and so forth, is where that logic really comes to bear, because we just cannot allow the growing momentum from throwing people under the bus environmental crisis. So for me, what we hope to do with this ultimately is to create resources about the existence of turbulence, what could be done in response to it that are freely available, that has part of a model that's more elite focused about getting to and helping some emerging career leaders and so on. But more than that, trying to have a more of a distributed model that could provide resources to any sort of setting to try and help, you know. And I think that as a last word, this is one of the key things I think about often with this work, is that we are entering this new era, this new chapter, and that's something that cannot be centralized. The response that cannot be centralized, because it is affecting the entire world, our interconnected systems and so on. You know, this was left too late. That is already a global tragedy, and it is maddening, it is frightening, but we have to go through the process of grief that will always be there so that we can better hold on to each other as we weather that growing storm.
Indeed. Tess, any reflections on either the tech question or the education question, or other takeaways you'd like to leave us with tonight?
On the education question, I'm actually, I guess, really hopeful, and I think there's a role for government to support the community educational initiatives that are actually out there and making a difference. So I've been into schools and had kids show me their school community garden and tell me about Greta Thunberg and biodiversity, which I think as an 8-year-old, I didn't even know what that meant. So I'm really hopeful, but I just see a disconnect at the moment between government investment and these amazing educational initiatives that are in place.
A good observation. Nina, any thoughts on tech or education or other closing thoughts?
Yeah, so very much like Tessa, I had my 11-year-old niece visiting me in Oxford a few weeks ago, and she was telling me about how she ran for student council on a platform of no bullying, longer breaks, and everyone should bike to school. So the first two I could recognize from sort of my own time in grade 3, but yeah, I definitely think there is a greater level of awareness there. I'm very excited about the Cohort 2040 project, and I think my main takeaway, like from today, but also from the work we've done with the climate warriors over the past year, is for the need to be concrete and to sort of move away from discussing how big this problem is, and to start actually learning the capabilities and the knowledge and the actual skills it'll take to be part of the solution. And I think Nairi Wood said something to us, who's the dean of our school. She said something to us on the first day when we started, when somebody asked her about the role of activists in the political space. She said the role of activists is very, very important, but it's important for everyone to recognize what room they're in and what abilities they have, what networks they have, and sort of whether those networks and those abilities are best used sort of lifting signs on the street, or by moving into some rooms where other decisions are made. Yeah, so excited about the Cohort 2040 project to teach a lot of people about how to move into those rooms.
Thank you, Nina. So thank you all for coming. It's a conversation we're, of course, in the middle of, but one I think we really want to focus a lot more on over the next few years. We are a young school of public policy. We're 10 years old as an institution, and I think we have a real interest in thinking about this century in which we were founded and the unique challenges that it faces, the temporally specific nature of our effort together. And so looking forward to continuing the conversation with all of you on that in the future. Larry, I think I probably count as what's called horribly a geriatric millennial. And I think you might be somewhat in a similar category if I read your retirement age correctly. But it really is about a transformation, and what came before will not be the same as what comes next. And I think for a place like Oxford, that's both challenging because we're an old place, but that's also inspiring because it means that we can see the long picture, and that's what we want to look forward to and not just back to going forward. So thank you, Larry. Thank you, Tessa and Nina. Thank you all for joining us, and please give a big round of applause for all of our contributions tonight.